Okay, I'm really, really excited about this. This is the first time that my buddy Ryan and I are going to be doing some interviews together, and I've figured what better place to start than a festival that both of us are just so enamored with and excited about every year, and that's Fantasia. So this year at Fantasia, Ryan and I decided that we were going to see a bunch of movies together, and then we were going to try to track down the creators, and get a little bit of what went into these films. And one of the ones that caught my attention and Ryan's attention this year was Woodlands, Dark, and Days Bewitched. Kier-La Janisse is the director of this film. And Kier-La, first of all, welcome.
Thank you.
This is extensive. This is thorough. And this definitely, after watching this, made me realize I'm going to be putting a massive dent in my pocketbook trying to buy a lot of these movies I had never heard of.
Yeah.
Tell me a bit about this, because this is a documentary that goes full deep into horror folk.
Yeah, well, I think that is just kind of how I do a lot of my projects, So, I mean, this is my first film that I've made, but I've done a lot of books either as a writer or an editor, and I do tend to try to be as comprehensive as possible. With, and the challenge is always making it as comprehensive as possible without it just seeming like a list of stuff, And so this originally started off as a bonus feature. I work for Severin Films, which is a Blu-ray company that does restorations and releases sort of lavish collector's editions of cult and genre film classics and stuff. And so we were going to be releasing the folk horror film Blood on Satan's Claw. And I proposed that we just do kind of a short folk horror documentary, a featurette of like half an hour, just kind of talking about the history of British folk horror and how that relates to the film. And so it really just started off as that. It was kind of an unambitious project. We were going to interview a few people for it, but it was a turning point for me at the company at Severin also, because up to that point, I'd only been an editor. So I would just get footage, get assignments, and be working with a director who would then tell me where they wanted things and stuff. And so this was the first one that I had proposed, and my boss just said, like, okay, go and do it. Enough people that, the right people who you would want to talk to for this. So just arrange to get them filmed and whatever. And so it was actually my first time producing, writing, directing anything. And so my job ended up even shifting at Severin, where I now mostly kind of produce extras more than editing them.
And I'm sure a lot of people that know Fantasia are familiar with Severin. I am too. It's always a point of contention between my wife and I when she gets those bills, because they do. boutique labels are near and dear to my heart. But that's the thing with Severin and with labels like Arrow and like Vinegar Syndrome and Shout. It's the extras, and this is what this felt like. This felt like everything that a fan would want to know, but it went in deep. I mean, you took this genre and I don't know. I found it very, very thorough. So kudos to you on that. I think this is a must see for fans of not only the horror genre, but just fans of film in general, because these are the kind of things that really, really get nerds like myself and Ryan really excited.
Yeah, no, and it was funny because, obviously, to me, a big thing that made the film work is the people, right? The people who are in the film, who are the speakers. Many of them have written books about folk horror or have written books about the specific research areas that I asked them about. I mean, these are extremely knowledgeable people. So I don't actually consider myself the folk horror expert as much as the people in the film are. So it was really their material that I was then shaping to make the film, and it's funny because at a certain point, I'd be editing stuff together and realize it'd be really good if I just had somebody to say this one thing to connect these two ideas. And so I ended up being in the film myself as that person, and Ryan filmed some of those. He filmed me at my friend Leanne's house in Montreal. So
yeah, I remember watching the movie and being really interested. I'm like, wow, this is such a good doc. And I'm just like, hey, Kier-La's in this. But I shot the part where she was like, it can't be this. I mean, I shot her on a sofa. There it is. Oh my God. This is the first ever thing I've ever filmed that was in a movie of any kind at Fantasia. So it was quite a moment, Kier-La. So thank you very much for including me in this.
Yeah, no problem. It was kind of great because my friend lived in this place where she had this red velvet sofa, and a brick wall behind it. It was kind of like perfect. It almost looked like a set.
I was going to ask this later on, but I want to ask now. Is this getting a physical release?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good.
Well, Severin Films is a Blu-ray company, right? So our end goal with the film has always been home video.
Mm-hmm.
And, giving it the release and the extras and all the stuff that Severin normally does. And so the fact that it's been playing festivals and everything, that's actually just icing to us,
right?
Because our goal was actually just to make a film for Blu-ray. And so it will be coming out. There will be actually a big announcement on Monday. So people are going to want to pay attention to that.
Ooh, I can't wait.
Big announcement coming on Monday that lists the details of the physical release of the film. But it's pretty exciting, I will say that, because like anybody who follows Severin Films knows that we always try to, put all the bells and whistles on our releases as much as possible.
Yeah.
And so this release is no different.
Well, I picked up the Santa Sangre release and it's just like amazing.
Yeah.
So when you're doing research for something like this, and there's no doubt that in the last probably 5, maybe 7 years, there's been a whole spotlight on folk horror, with a lot of the new guns, if you will, in the horror business, coming out with just classic after classic. Movies that are becoming they're going to be staples in people's horror diet. Why do you think that is? Because do you think it's the generation that grew up on the 80s folk horror that are at an age now where they can create and they can make their own stuff, and that is why there might have been that little bit of a gap?
I think it depends where you're from.
Right.
So I think like for a lot of the British filmmakers, it was the 70s stuff that was influential to them. And so that was why you started to see the first wave of like new British folk horror around the time of Ben Wheatley's A Field in England, right? So around the time of 2012, 2013, that was when they started to have their first big, revival or whatever of folk horror. And for the Americans, it's taken a bit longer. And part of that is because the British films were not the main influence on them. It was 80s stuff,
Right.
So it was more things like Children of the Corn or whatever. And so the American revival of folk horror has been maybe 5 years behind the British one. And what that has meant also is that the British have really dominated a lot of discussions around folk horror because they kind of like this whole subculture grew around it earlier than, the American one. And then as you find out in the film, it then starts branching out to like everywhere where people in other countries are going like, I wonder what films from our history would be considered folk horror films, and, but it's just at the point now where filmmakers are actively choosing to make a folk horror film, like a film that fits those particular tropes or that kind of atmosphere or those kind of environments or whatever. Whereas a lot of the people making them in the 70s were not active. They weren't trying to make a film that fit into a folk horror mold, even though the term folk horror did exist then, it wasn't widely used the way it is now, so it was not a common reference for people to be like, oh, I want to make a film like that. And a lot of the older filmmakers who were making films in the 70s, when you ask them about folk horror, they're like, what is that? Like they don't understand how their films fit into a genre like that at all. Like they can't see it, whereas like people who are making films now, they can say, I am a fan of folk horror and I want to make a film that is a folk horror film, so the films are very different. I would say there's probably more folk horror films being made now in the last 5 years than there were in the 70s.
And it's funny when I remember when I walked out of the press screening of Midsommar. I mean, obviously I went because it was A24, B it was Ari. So I was like, all right, I loved it. And then, as we all do, we go to our communities and our little groups that we geek out with. And I remember going to one of my horror Facebook groups and someone was like, well, you have to see The Wicker Man. I'm like, Wicker Man, never heard of that. So I, of course, went out and got it. And I was like, oh, so that's what I think I love the most about this documentary. Because I'm a fan. I'm a big, and like Ryan, we're both film fans. But I think why Ryan and I have such a good friendship is that we're both very teachable. So I love the idea of saying, I'm a fan, give me more. So this is the perfect doc for someone.
And there always is more, that's the fun thing about being a fan too, is that no matter how much you think there's always like tons of stuff out there you've just never heard of,
Ryan, I don't know about you, but when you watch this, did you, I had a pen and paper next to me and I was just writing down titles like, I've got to check this out. I've never seen this. Oh, this is like.
The most notable thing I noticed about this movie highlighting the original Wicker Man is that I had only really seen clips of the Nicolas Cage Wicker Man, which is a subject of mockery in a sense. So to see the original Wicker Man, I'm like, wow, this looks terrifying.
Yeah.
And I need to jump into the folk horror genre more, because I'm more of and I've read your book. I love Yuletide Terror, A History of Holiday Horror. By the way, Jason, it's an amazing book.
Yeah, I know. Well, you've strongly. So I've been
telling you about the book for years,
and
actually,
I've been telling him about A24 and movies that he
Yeah.
needs to see for years. And so, we're gonna make that right.
But something I love about this documentary is it's not shy with its runtime. Like there's been this new resurgence of horror documentaries that aren't shy about showing you everything. And In Search of Darkness is an example of that, where there's these 2, 3, 4 hour documentaries, and Crystal Lake Memories. I noticed that this was 3 hours. Were you ever hesitant to give a runtime like this? Or did you say, hey, this is for Blu-ray fans. They want everything in the kitchen sink. Let's give it to them.
Well, I wasn't worried about the runtime, and neither was my boss, actually, because we knew that the end game was home video. We knew it was going to be Blu-ray or it was going to be streaming. It was going to be people watching it at home for the most part, so they can stop it if they want to, and go get snacks or whatever. And so because for us, we knew that there were all these avenues in like streaming and Blu-ray and things like that, that the runtime was not really that daunting, and we did look at films like In Search of Darkness and Crystal Lake Memories and stuff and be like, well, see, like this movie is 7 hours long or whatever. And that's fine to people. Nobody's complaining about that, so it just needs to be as long as it needs to be. And, like, if anything, I feel like it could have been longer, but there was stuff I cut out. I mean, partially like the only concern about time for me was once I realized that it was good enough to potentially get into a film festival, because I wasn't thinking that when I first made it. I didn't think it was going to be good enough. I thought, because I'd never made a movie before, So, but once I started to feel like, okay, this actually is turning out pretty good, maybe I could submit it to a festival. Then the runtime becomes an issue, because you're thinking, well, nobody's going to program it if it's over a certain amount of time. It still wasn't a determining factor or a deciding factor for me. So it was still going to be as long as it needed to be. But it was the only time I really thought about it, was like when I was like, okay, I have to be prepared for it being rejected from a lot of festivals because of the length. And as long as I'm okay with that, then fine. I'll just make it as long as it needs to be.
What else have you worked on at Severin that people would, if people walked away from this saying, man, this was really well researched, this was really well put together, what other stuff at Severin would people want to see that you had a lot to do with?
I would say, so the biggest thing that I did recently was we did this box set, which I kind of oversee the whole box set, including the artwork and everything, was for the Kinky films of Eloy de la Iglesia. So he's a Spanish director, and Kinky is not spelt like the American Kinky. It's spelled Quinqui, Kinky, and it's short for the word quinceañero. But they are essentially juvenile delinquent films from the late 70s and early 80s in Spain. And so we released 3 of these films. There was a whole bunch of them, but we released 3 of them in a set, all by the same director, Eloy de la Iglesia. And they're just full of like crime and like drug addiction and, like underage sex, like not actual underage sex, but you know what I mean? Yeah. Just like juvenile delinquent films, like Over the Edge or Christian F or whatever, like these kinds of films, except made in Spain. And so, and also the director was gay. So there was a lot of like gay subtext in the films and stuff like that. And so we did the first ever North American release of these films, like with subtitles, and got a lot of the people are dead from the films, but we had like amazing critical commentaries, and we made my friend Dawn Adams and I made a 45-minute documentary about what is the kinky film, basically like an introduction for North American audiences. And stylistically, it's completely different from Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched, because it's much more like fast paced and more like whooshes and whatever stuff like that. So it doesn't look anything like Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched, but that is something that I definitely had a big hand in and became really obsessed with. And so that set, I would highly recommend to anyone who wants to see more of stuff I've done at Severin. I also worked a lot on when we released V, the Russian folk horror film V, which is in the folk horror doc. Mm-hmm. So I did I think it was like a 30-minute documentary or something on that. That was just about Soviet horror and fantasy films, like Soviet horror, sci-fi, and fantasy films. And one of the the main interviewee in that featurette is actually, we got like outtakes from that are in the folk horror movie too. So, but yeah, those are kind of like two big things I worked on, and then a bunch of other stuff that's like still in the works now that hasn't been announced yet.
See, this is the thing. What people like you do is so important, because there's so many films that come out that never see the light of day when it comes to home video releases, or especially Blu-ray releases. They might have gotten a VHS release in a certain country, but we live in a big world. I mean, we live in a small world, but we live in a big world, and there's a lot of films that have been made. So companies like yours that you work for, I think it's crucial that people are exposed to this stuff, and it makes your film going experience so much broader and so much better, I think.
Yeah. Thank you. And it's, I mean, one of the big challenges of doing home video like this, especially when you are kind of exposing new audiences to films they haven't heard of before, is, it's expensive to put out movies. So it's always a risk. You're always trying to be the champion for these films and hoping that people will pick it up and will take your advice and listen to you. And especially like in a case like certain films that maybe are completely unknown in North America are massive hits in the countries they come from. And so those negotiations can be difficult sometimes, because the value of those films to their producers in their home countries, the value of their films to them is completely different from what their value to be in the States, where they're unknown so far,
Right.
And so trying to be respectful of the films and of their legacy and their pedigree and everything, while also acknowledging the practicalities of what is the actual audience for this in North America, and trying to balance that and make it so that it's actually feasible and this can work. That's a big part of the challenge of the job too.
Did you hit any roadblocks when you were working on Woodlands Dark? Did you hit any? Were there any roadblocks? Was there anything that you maybe tried to get, or someone you tried to talk to, or something you tried to shed some light on that just you were blocked, like you weren't able to do it? Or was everybody pretty?
Were certain films that we just couldn't get good enough quality of, and so like originally the Brazilian section was much longer, but we had to cut a lot of it because we just the clips were just not that we could get were just not good enough quality to be spending a whole bunch of time on them. Yeah. And unfortunately, the situation in Brazil, I don't know if you know, but it's like, all the films in the country are housed at the Cinematheque in Brazil, and which has, been completely abandoned by the government there. And it's flooded a few times. And they most recently had a fire and lost like 2,000 films, and so there's a lot of like filmmakers in Brazil who are kind of protesting this and trying to get the government to like get, allow access. It was like everybody got fired from there, and so all these negatives, everybody's negatives and stuff are in this place, so it's like films are actually being destroyed and lost in Brazil. So that was something we actually came up against when we were making the documentary. Was we wanted access to certain films. We knew the materials were in the Brazilian Cinematheque, but nobody who worked there was allowed in the building. Like they'd all been fired and the building was abandoned. So there were certain things like that, and then there was like another British film called A Photograph, which was like a play for today, written by the same guy who had done Robin Redbreast, which is in the film. but we couldn't get a copy of that film that didn't have a time code on screen, and it wasn't like a usable copy. So we originally had a discussion around that film that got taken out. So there was like certain things like that where it was like the quality of the footage wasn't good enough to use, and so entire chunks would be taken out. Obviously, it would have been very nice to have Ben Wheatley and Ari Aster in the film, and that's the number one question I think everybody asked me at first was like, why isn't Ben Wheatley in the film? And it's kind of funny because Ben and I have a friend in common, or like a producer in common. And, we have a lot of connections to each other, but, he just wasn't comfortable being in the doc, and and also it's just like some filmmakers, like you'll notice a lot of the people in the film are more like scholars and historians more than filmmakers, and part of it is just that filmmakers speak with their films, that is how they articulate their ideas. Like they don't really want to like sit there and talk about the ideas and explain everything because they make their films and that is their art and that is how they actually express their ideas, and so the imagery from their films had to stand as their voice in the film. It's
quite an accomplishment that you put this together, and I have to commend you again on this. Great work, and I think people need to see this. If you're a fan of horror films, and if you love getting educated, I really encourage people to see Woodlands, Darkened Days, Bewitched, and look out for this. I'm really excited about this Blu-ray release now that you're telling me, because
Jason's one of the biggest Blu-ray dorks I know. Like, as obsessed with the look, the feel, the special features, everything about physical media that is still makes anybody buy a Blu-ray these days. Actually, it's that kind of effort. So it's thanks to people like you. So thank you very much for doing what you do, because you're keeping home releases alive. Honestly,
thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm glad you like it.
Loved it, and I encourage people to go check it out. Kier-La, thanks so much for taking the time to chat today.
No problem. Thank you, guys.